Well, welcome to episode 68 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time we're going to talk about a stone cold classic from 1975 in the jazz funk genre, Johnny Hammond's album Gears. And this one came out on Milestone. This is the first UK pressing of that album. It's actually quite hard to find, which is a bit strange because it really is a delicious record. So as I mentioned, this is jazz funk. It's produced by the Meisels brothers, Larry and Fonce, who are legends in 1970s production, jazz funk, disco, and kind of the line in between there. That's a mixed blessing in this album, as I'll discuss, because sometimes their presence somewhat overwhelms. But nevertheless, when their names are associated with an album, there's always quality involved, and that's always something to look for. By the same token, jazz purists who were already struggling with jazz's move into funk and rock fusion and so on in the early 70s would likely balk at this record, and it's quite easy to read reviews of albums such as this and conclude that there's really nothing of worth. You really have to see who is actually reviewing the record and what lens they're bringing to it, because if they're bringing, if they're expecting this to be soul jazz or bop, you're not going to get that, and that's fine. This is something totally different. Still jazz, but it's that happy land between jazz, funk, and R&B, and it's really, really good. So Johnny Hammond, of course, isn't actually Johnny Hammond's real name. It's Johnny Smith. There was another Johnny Smith, and Johnny Hammond, was a whiz on the Hammond organ, so he took Hammond as a nickname. So you'll find his recordings under Johnny Smith, Johnny Hammond Smith, and then more laterally under Johnny Hammond. It's the same guy. He cut his teeth in the 1960s with Prestige as a soul jazz specialist on the organ, obviously. And so he's a contemporary of, and really one of the chief exponents of the Hammond, along with Jimmy Smith and Charles Earland. There are other examples, of course, but those are three of the better known exponents. In the early 70s, along with a lot of other people who had been in the soul jazz world, he got involved with that character Creed Taylor and his label CTI and other impressions within CTI, such as Kudu. CTI was probably the leading home of jazz funk in the early 1970s, and Hammond does a number of albums for Taylor on Kudu. As time goes by, as he gets more into the funk vein, he connects with the Meisels brothers. Now, these guys, as I've mentioned, are legends in the funk and disco world, particularly through the 1970s. Larry had actually been a technician for NASA, including doing testing on the lunar module for the Apollo program. Now the Meisels, just like at CTI with Creed Taylor and Bob James and all the kind of the great stable of musicians that they had there, the Meisels also had their house band. They had Chuck Rainey on bass, they had Harvey Mason on drums, they had Jerry Peters on piano, and you'll often find these musicians popping up. The Meisels themselves were also musicians. Fonce plays the clavinet, that definitive jazz funk instrument, and also does vocals. Larry plays a Selena, which is a kind of a string ensemble synth, an ARP synth, and also does vocals as well. And their vocals, the two of them, the brothers, are quite present. So again, Hammond is really engaging not just with the Meisels as producers, but with a fully functioning five-piece band, and that has consequences for the way the music plays out. For instance, the Meisels write all the songs in this album. They co-write one of them with Hammond, which I think is Fantasy, the first track on side 2. And so just as was to happen with some of the other leaders of jazz funk albums and some of these labels in the 70s, Lonnie Smith is another example of this. As time goes by, as these sort of in-house production teams and house bands become more and more effective at cranking out really high quality and commercially desirable jazz funk, the putative leaders of these albums tend to get swallowed up a little bit in the mix. And that's a problem, I think, if you're looking at this album saying, hey, I want to hear more Johnny Hammond. If you're a big fan of his soul jazz from the 1960s, you're going to be and that's what you want to hear. You're going to be disappointed by this album because there are little outcroppings of that, but really not very much. If what you really dig is the groove of really excellently constructed and written jazz funk with some great players on it, including Johnny Hammond, then you're going to be very satisfied with this record. Hammond is here, he's a band member, but he's not the center of it all. So side 1 starts with Tell Me What to Do, and right away you've got John Rowan and Craig McMullen giving you this excellent wah-wah and chicken scratch guitar on either channel. You're right into that funk lane. The Meisels are already crooning away, tell me what to do. The groove of the song doesn't really settle in for a minute or two. There's a really quite extended introductory passage. But then they get into the pocket, and then Johnny starts to stretch out on the Hammond. This is a good song. It's not a great song. It feels a little bit like the way it's constructed, and the degree of sort of flourish and anticipation relative to the relatively small amount of actually being in the groove. It sort of feels like an overture for the rest of the album rather than a song you go back to, listen to again and again. But that's okay, because it leads into Los Conquistadores Chocolates, which is the best song in the album and is an absolute classic of the genre. Now, this is also quite an important song historically, because this was a song which was played heavily by legendary DJ Larry Levan at David Mancuso's loft parties in New York in the mid-1970s. It's also one of the very first tracks that gets spun a lot at the Paradise Garage. So in other words, this is a song which is absolutely present at the birth of disco. It's not a disco song necessarily, but it's what the people who eventually formed disco were working with at the very beginning in sort of creating the sound of the club and the expectation of the crowd and so on. So this is really ground zero for disco. So Harvey Mason, as I mentioned, is on drums, and he of course had done a lot of work with Creed Taylor and a whole bunch of really epic jazz funk albums earlier on. He's a classic CTI house band guy. Here he continues the amazing syncopation work he'd been doing on the first track. And the band settles into the pocket a lot earlier here, driven again by Mason on drums and Chuck Rainey on bass, really quite present in the mix. Both guitars start to stretch their wings simultaneously, and then Hammond comes in and plays some righteously funky lines. And you're into one of the great passages in the history of jazz funk. There are some amazing moments here. If like me, what you do is spin jazz funk records constantly, looking for the perfect pockety groove. For me, this is really close to that. Sadly, it fades out a little early, but still an epic track, a memorable track, and quite a historic track. Then side one closes out with Lost on 23rd Street. Here, as far as I can tell, Johnny's actually on synth, and I think they got the French horn button selected. Rainey's bass is quite high in the mix, very satisfying. This is the most jazzy song on the side, and it's actually the jazziest song on the whole album. It's just okay, not a bad way to end the album side, but not necessarily that brilliant. Side two starts with Fantasy, which is the song co-written by Hammond and the Meisels. Kind of strangely, Hammond has a solo of kind, but it isn't really towards the end of the song, and it's not particularly prominent. And he's actually more prominent on some of the other pieces of music on this record, which he didn't write. So it's just a bit strange that he wrote this track. You'd think that would be a vehicle for him. At least that was what I was anticipating when I first spun it, but no such luck. There are some great parts to this song, though, with Mason on drums and Kenneth Nash on bongos, laying down a really righteous beat. And the other quite notable aspect of this song is Roger Glenn's work on flute. Flute, of course, is somewhat counterintuitively becomes a real staple of jazz funk, largely, I suspect, due to the influential work done by Bobby Humphrey on albums like Blacks and Blues and so on. Anyway, flute is quite present here, and Roger Glenn's playing is really good. Shifting Gears, which is maybe the only other song which rivals Los Conquistadores Chocolates as a famous song off this album. And this is another just excellent groove from Mason and Rainey. It really is probably the song on which Hammond really shows up and is produced like the leader of the album that he supposedly is. It's a really excellent piece of music. It's a very, very funky tune. It's a jazz funk, kind of a jazz funk standard, because I don't know if jazz funk lasted long enough to have standards which were then replicated, but it's certainly a jazz funk classic. Somewhat disappointingly, because it's such a strong song, there's a fade out which begins really early, and it starts to sap the energy from a song that I would have been quite happy to have had another 2 or 3 minutes of. So there you go. And then the album closes with Can't We Smile, which has got a few little oddities. It starts off with some flourishes from Jerry Peters on piano. Then we have some work on synth. I don't think it's Hammond, I think it's somebody else, which sounds for all the world like the opening credits from Star Trek. I just can't get that out of my head when I listen to this. I don't think that's the intent. I'm sure it wasn't. You have a little gentle solo from Johnny Hammond. You've got the Meisels, singing, like why can't we smile all the while, baby? Not a super sort of cerebral or challenging lyric. It's, not a bad song, and that's the end of the album. So as I say, this is a jazz funk classic. It's important historically because of Los Conquistadores Chocolates, which is such an important song, the foundation of disco. It's got several other tracks, at least 3 others, that are really solid, groovy jazz funk tracks. So that's 4 of the 6 are really great. The main complaint I have about this album is the production team is too dominant. Their contributions increase the quality in lots of ways, but also tend to make the music a little lightweight at times. Had they given Hammond a little more profile, they could have kept it just as funky, because he's certainly up to matching whatever they could dish out in that area. So for me, it's a 4 out of 5 album, but definitely if you're a jazz funk fan, worth picking up. Don't read the reviews, just buy the album, listen to it.